It was one of the deadliest disasters in California history, but you won't hear about it on school field trips or glossy tourist brochures. And even though hundreds died, the official number is suspiciously low because most of the victims weren't the kind of people Los Angeles wanted to remember. They were workers, immigrants, poor families, the invisible ones. And when the St. Francis Dam collapsed in 1928, the city didn't just bury them under mud and rubble, it buried the truth. The man behind the disaster was William Mulholland, the so-called mastermind who turned Los Angeles from a desert town into a booming metropolis. He was the architect of the LA Aqueduct, the guy who stole the Owens Valley's water and brought it to a thirsty, growing city. To many, he was a genius, a visionary, the kind of man people toasted at banquets. But to others, he was arrogant and reckless, someone who refused to listen when people warned him he was gambling with lives. When he pushed for the construction of the St. Francis Dam in San Francisco Canyon, just north of LA, those same cracks started to show, not just in the concrete, but in his judgment. The terrain was unstable, the rock wasn't right, but Mulholland insisted it would hold because he said so. On the night of March 12, 1928, just minutes before midnight, the dam didn't just spring a leak, it utterly collapsed. It failed in silence at first, then roared to life as over 12 billion gallons of water exploded out of the canyon like a monster unchained. A 10-story wall of water came barreling down the valley with terrifying speed, leveling everything in its path. There were no warning sirens, no alerts. Families were asleep in their beds. Children were dreaming. Within minutes, entire communities were shredded off the face of the earth. It was so sudden and brutal that many victims were never found at all, just ripped away in the dark and swallowed by the mud. The wave didn't slow down. It tore through the Santa Clara River Valley, ripping through ranches, bridges, telephone lines, even railroads. Towns like Castaic, Fillmore, and Santa Paula were blindsided. Entire families were crushed by debris, drowned in their own homes, or swept dozens of miles downstream. Corpses were found 50 miles away, bloated and buried in silt. It was carnage. Survivors described seeing livestock, furniture, and human bodies all tumbling together in the flood, a sick slurry of everything people once called home. By the time the water reached the Pacific Ocean, it had carved a 54-mile scar across Southern California. But the real damage was just beginning. The next morning, headlines were already spinning. Tragic, they said. Unexpected, but the numbers didn't add up. Early estimates said 500 dead, then it dropped to 400, then it was just 385. How does a body count go down after a disaster? The answer is simple. Most of the dead weren't people the city wanted to count. Many of them were Mexican migrant workers and their families who lived in makeshift camps downstream. Others were Chinese rail workers or undocumented laborers who had no birth certificates, no green cards, no legal presence at all. When it came time to tally the losses, the city didn't just forget them, it erased them on purpose. City Hall didn't want a scandal. The water department didn't want lawsuits. The newspapers didn't want to scare investors. And Mulholland? He wanted to protect what little was left of his reputation. So the cleanup wasn't just physical, it was political. Bodies were quietly buried in mass graves. Identities were left unconfirmed. If no one was around to claim a victim, they were crossed off the list. The official death toll became a fiction, one the city repeated over and over until the truth was buried deeper than the bodies themselves. Historians now believe the real number of deaths was close to 1,000. There were no criminal charges, no public trials. Mulholland resigned with a heavy heart and a hollow apology. "I only envy the dead." That was it. He got to retire peacefully while entire towns had to rebuild from scratch. Survivors weren't given payouts or therapy. They were left to deal with grief, trauma, and ruins. And many of them, especially the poor and undocumented, didn't even get that. They were simply forgotten. No photos, no names, just washed away. For decades, the disaster became a footnote, a lesson learned for engineers, a minor chapter in LA's glossy story of progress. School textbooks didn't mention the migrant camps. Tourists, snapping photos at the ruins, never heard about the children buried alive. And Hollywood, It never touched the story. Too messy, too dark, not enough pretty endings. So the city moved on, faster than the water that destroyed it. But if you drive up San Francisco Canyon today, you'll find the ruins still sitting there, sun-bleached, cracked, and silent. Jagged slabs of concrete that once promised safety now look like headstones for the lives they ended. There's no grand memorial, no solemn museum, just a quiet hillside and the occasional tourist who stumbles onto a tragedy no one wants to talk about. And maybe that's the most damning detail of all. LA buried its disaster, then paved over it with silence. Because the St. Francis Dam collapse wasn't just a structural failure, it was a failure of humanity. It exposed how little the city valued the lives of the people who built it, how quickly it could erase the dead, and how easily it could pretend none of it ever happened. But in the cracks of that ruined dam, and in the stories still whispered by the families who remember, the truth is still there, waiting, heavy, and soaked in the blood LA never wanted to count.